When I first started into the domain industry, I really focused on the end user. And I started asking this question, like, why do brands buy domain names? Like what would compel a brand in a startup? Maybe a startup that's kind of scratching by, maybe a startup that's well funded, maybe it's a Fortune 500 company. What would compel them to spend $200,000, $300,000, $1 million, $2 million on a domain name? And I knew that if I could answer these questions, why they bought, I would also be good on the other side of it, okay, the other side, the investing side of it, being able to pick good domain names. But I really started with that question. Now, I came from a completely different industry. I came from the retail industry. I'd managed accounts selling to Walmart, Target, and Sam's Club, negotiated with some of the best negotiators in the world. Domain names were just a very foreign thing. Like everything was done at the retail level. And so when I came into to the online space and domain names, I really like had to step back and educate myself. One of the things that was like the prevailing way to educate and explain domain names back at this time was that domain names were like real estate. And it was like, hey, you get it on Broadway or it's several streets off of Broadway. It's Avenue of the Americas versus Broadway versus this. Don't you want your store to be on like the premier place, right? You want the premier real estate for your brand. And what I found is that this didn't really motivate and move the needle for the buyers that I was working with. Now, it's a very good way to say and explain domain names because domain names are digital assets, digital property. Andrew says that all the time. It's like the original digital asset, the original NFT, right, are domain names. And they've been one of the best asset classes to invest in over the last 20 years. But that didn't motivate, didn't really explain why companies are spending money to acquire the raw version of the brand. At this point, I went on this journey to discover it, to really get into and answer this reason why. And I started to pull information from SEO, from branding, from marketers, and I started to see some trends emerging. Now I categorize these trends into 7 dimensions, the 7 like critical and crucial ways that a domain name impacts a brand. And what I found in doing this is that inevitably there was always one of these dimensions, okay, one that really kind of came out that was the reason why the company needed to buy this. These are the fundamental reasons why your domain name is a must for your ability to scale. It can be the biggest risk for your brand, but there's a real logical case to owning your brand's domain name in the raw version. So the 7 dimensions of why a domain name and how a domain name impacts a brand are this. The first one is global positioning. And global positioning is just how you stand out in the world for every brand that calls themselves your same brand. Now, what is a brand? A brand is a mark, it's a word, it could be a logo of some sort. It's your way to differentiate yourself from the market. But the problem is that in most cases, there's more companies out there that also call themselves your brand. So I use a lot of examples like Carrot, Carrot.com, Carrot.co, Carrot. On Carrot, Get Carrot, right? All these other brands that call themselves Carrot. And you can go to pretty much any single keyword. Another great example I like to use is Kraken, Kraken Rum versus Kraken, the crypto exchange, right? Pick any keyword word, and this is global positioning. And so global positioning is actually super important. If you get this wrong, what happens is that you send traffic to another company, and you actually end up pre-framing your brand in a very negative light. And that is, hey, don't go over there, we're over here. This is the way that we talk about our brand because our domain name doesn't equal our brand. And this is a major impact. And so global positioning is the first dimension. The second dimension to how a domain impacts your brand is leadership positioning or industry position. Now, this is how you rank among your competitors. Okay, so there's this global view as far as domain names, but then it's also how do you rank amongst your competitors? Does your brand make you look like you are this perpetual startup? And what I heard over and over again over the years from startups that were looking to acquire their brand is, hey, Chris, it's time. We're growing up. We no longer can use the get or the my, the try, or the industry in our back, in the back, right? The domain name, maybe it's creative, maybe it's building, maybe it's insurance, whatever that is. They said, hey, it's time for us to grow up. We need to own our brand. We're committed to owning our brand. And this is something that we are going to make happen. This declaration that we are the only brand that matters that calls themselves this, and that's industry positioning. And when consumers come to your brand, There was a study done by Reese, and I want to say Reese and Reese, but when they came and they viewed it, like we rank things in our mind, right? So we have like if you ask them what's the top 10 cars, they rank them in their mind. The same thing happens in every industry. When they come to your product or services and they look at your competition, does your domain name instill trust compared to your industry? And this is the second reason, or the second dimension to a domain name. Now, the third dimension to a domain name is branding, and that is just simply this aspect that your domain equals your brand equity, right? Your domain name is your brand, which impacts your brand equity, which is this thought of trust, of loyalty, of being able to charge higher prices, of having consumers come back to you over and over and over again because of the essence of what your brand means. It was interesting. I tell the story a lot about Ring.com. When Ring.com sold to Amazon for $1 billion, the founders said alone, they said, hey, the domain's worth $40 to $45 million for Ring.com. And that was just the domain name alone and not just the brand equity. Now, we all know, Amazon probably most likely, I always say, could have knocked this product off overnight. They could have knocked it off overnight by calling their suppliers, and they didn't because of this thing of brand equity. And your domain name is a very real integral part of that. And so what happens is that your consumers, they naturally, they almost, because that's the only interaction they have with your brand, they gravitate over to your domain name. And so your domain name is very important for your branding. And the next one is marketing, how you market to make sure that you're not putting traffic, creating this clear path for your consumers to interact with you. Now, it's interesting because one of the things today there's private labels knocked off everywhere. And one of the key indicators of that, and trust, is your domain name, right? As they see the product come across, they see on a Facebook ad, they go back down, they look at your domain and say, hey, okay, is this someone I can trust? Or does this look like some fly-by-night, who knows what, kind of brand? And so it has a very real impact on the conversion for your marketing. There was one story of Hive.com. They said they had a 45% increase in their traffic overnight by acquiring Hive.com. And I believe there were Hive teams before that. I had another person reach out to me years ago. They said, hey, Chris, we're getting like 25,000 new visitors to our site every single day. We don't know what's going on, They dug into it and they realized that one of their competitors was actually doing a advertising marketing campaign and actually driving people to their site, actually driving it to the competitors. Your domain name is very important for your ability to market, your ability to create this simple and effortless path for your customers, in which that means profit, that means long-term customers, and it means trust for your brand. The fifth element is, or dimension, is the ability for SEO. And we work with the top SEO companies in the world, and I can tell you that they value great domain names, domain names that have this inherent traffic ability to them, and traffic instantly instill trust behind what they are. The sixth one is email security. Now, this one is a very interesting one. It's one that most people don't think about. Email security is it's very important because many times when your brand does not equal your domain name, your customers actually email that other person. But depending upon who owns that domain name, there can be a very real risk to your email security. In fact, we have many companies in the health industry that need to establish very robust email securities that'll buy their domain name solely for this dimension, solely for email security. So it's very important. It's one that's often overlooked, but you'd be surprised at how many emails actually are sent to the wrong company. You ask any domain investor, and they'll have dozens and dozens of stories of getting the strangest emails from the top venture capitalists. In that case, in that story, they were, they only sent it to one person, and that was the .com instead of .io, and so the company didn't even know they were getting these emails. The seventh and last dimension is your ability to scale. Now, this one is also a very important one. A lot of times when companies start off and startups start off, they're trying to bootstrap it, so they pick a domain that's very, very niche, and that allows them to carve out a niche and to get a foothold in the industry, but that doesn't allow them to scale. It doesn't allow them, as they gain dominance and they gain more share and they reach their threshold of share, most companies, in fact, I would say every company needs to scale and continue to scale. A lot of times this equals more product offerings. Now, in this case, a great example of this would be Zen Payroll and Gusto. Zen Payroll actually rebranded to Gusto because they started to do more than just payroll, and they realized that their domain name was actually keeping them back because people only thought of them as payroll. There's a lot of good articles out there from the founder, so I'd encourage you to go and look at those articles. But the ability to scale could be one of the most important domains as far as the risk that you have for your brand. All these dimensions, when you go back and you look at these dimensions, they impact your brand at some level. Now, some are going to have a much more impactful, let's say, global positioning. Some are going to have more industry positioning. Some are going to have more like this ability to scale because they've tapped out and they realize that their domain name is actually now is actually a weight now that's keeping them from growing. So if you understand the 7 dimensions, you can justify your ability to acquire the perfect domain name. And from an investor standpoint, you can also understand how to talk to founders, because this is the essence of why do you buy your domain name? Why do you spend the money that is being spent on these domain names to acquire them? And it comes down to the 7 dimensions. I just walked over the 7 dimensions as far as why companies need to acquire the domain name. The next step to this is, okay, well, how do you acquire your domain name? In most cases, what happens is that a founder goes into an investor round, or they go into a board meeting, and their board of directors is like, hey, why don't you own your domain name? And that sends this this scramble out there to say, okay, now we have the funding, we have the backing. Many times those venture capitalists, many times those the private equity, many times the board of directors actually have direct stories as far as the importance of a domain name, and they're able to instill this confidence in the founder to go out and acquire this because it is an asset and it is something that directly impacts the ability to convert your customers and a very simple path for your customers to interact with you. So the next stage to this is, well, now what do we do? How do we acquire our perfect domain name? Now, Mediaoptions, we have a 5-step approach to acquiring your perfect domain name. If you get this wrong, there's a very high likelihood that you're never going to acquire your perfect domain name. Now, I say that in one sense, it sounds very gimmicky, but you have to understand the complexity of domain names and why that's important. So the first step to this, the 5 steps in acquiring your domain name, is you need to know what domain name you want to acquire. Now, in most cases, this is the easiest step. The companies have already started off with some kind of domain name. Maybe they use a my or a try or a get in front. Maybe they've used a .io or .co or .net or .org, and they're looking to upgrade that to the .com. And so that's it's like the check mark. Now, if this is not the case, there's sites like Mediaoptions you can go to, dnx.com, where you can see and we give you access to the best portfolio of domain names, the best selection of domain names that you'll never see in the market, because a lot of these domain names aren't actively being marketed, but options for you. The next stage to that is to determine who owns this domain name. Now, there's 3 different types of owners to a domain name, and it's very important that you get this right. So the first owner type is the business type. Now, depending upon the size of the business, this business could have gone through some kind of acquisition process where they acquired that. They could have gone through rebrand themselves. They could have bought that for a sub-brand that they have that they're looking to grow. But one of the key things here is risk, because no one gets fired for holding onto a domain name, but you do get fired if you sell a domain name. And so one of the keys indicators here as far as the negotiation process is the risk factor and lowering the risk factor when you're reaching out and trying to acquire that. Now, the second owner type is the domain investor. Now, this type of owner is exactly what it says. It's someone who buys domain names at a certain price and holds them to sell them at a higher price. And there's a certain return on investment that they want. Now, it's important to know with this type of owner type is that, there's always the question, did I get enough out of this? Did I ask for enough out of this domain name? Could I have asked for 10x, or could I have asked for 20x what I'm asking, and what maybe I would have accepted had I not known who you are? So the very real way to approach the domain investor to make sure that a deal can get done, and that the price doesn't go off into a level that no one benefits and no one ends up becoming a winner. Now, the third owner type is the personal owner, and this is someone, and we come across this type of owner quite a bit, who's owned the domain name maybe for 15 to 20 years, and it really becomes like this badge. They go into their party and they say, hey, email me this email, and everyone's like, wow, how did you get that? That's amazing, right? Because they understand this is unique, and so it becomes part of their identity. And at this type of owner, there's a very real way to talk to this to make sure that they can see the value as far as maybe selling it for the right price and getting that domain name home. And in most cases, this type of owner wants the pride out of their hands. So the second step is who owns this domain name. The third step is what is the value for this domain name. Okay. Now, I often say in negotiations, everyone wants to pay nothing, right? And every domain owner wants to sell it for the stars. And so, there needs to be a way to actually look at what is the market value for this? And then, based on that market value for this domain name, what is the price that you could acquire this for. And sometimes those are the same. Sometimes they're very different. It all depends. I talk many times in my videos about market value, and I break this down into 3 pillars. The 3 pillars of market value. The first one is what is the raw equity that's out there. Now, earlier in this, I talked about 7 dimensions. I talked about SEO. Raw equity directly ties back to this element of SEO. It's like, what is the exact match search and what is the CPC? So in essence, what does the market value this keyword at? Now, if you take a domain like quilt.com, have several different companies that are called Quilt that aren't selling quilts, that's not the point. It's really what is the wind that's behind this domain name that makes this domain name valuable. It's the raw equity. And there's an equation that we use. You can go to our site, you can see that equation. It takes into account this exact match search function, multiplied by over a year, the CPC, and it gets to a pretty accurate value for what this domain is worth because there's actual money and dollars spent on this domain name. Now, the second pillar is brand equity, and that's how many brands are out there. And the more brands that are out there, the bigger that they are, the more equity that they have in this keyword, hence the more valuable this keyword is. And the third pillar is perceived equity. Now, when you're looking to acquire your domain name, you need to understand this. And this is oftentimes one of the reasons why we're not a good fit for helping companies, is because what it's going to take to acquire the domain name is like astronomically lower than what it's going to take to buy this domain name. And in many instances, like there would be domain investors lining up to buy it at the price that they want to buy it at. And so you have to realize there's a very real market for domain names. And based on the value of domain name, there's a limit to what it potentially could sell at, and there's a limit to what what the market kind of bears with this domain name. So that's the third pillar, is determining the value. If you get those 3 down and you understand those 3, then you can go out to the next stage for domain acquisition, and that's negotiation. It's very important in this negotiation process that you keep in mind the second buyer type. What is it going to take to get ours to the finish line and to negotiate this deal? Now, we've had negotiations that last anywhere from several days to years in negotiating domain name acquisitions and domain name sales. And so it all depends on the timing, the market, but negotiation will be the next stage for domain acquisition. And then the 5th and final stage is just closing it and getting across the finish line. And this is a stage in and of itself because in many instances, there's some acquisitions that we've done where you literally have to drag it across the finish line to get it across. So whether there's legal documents that need to take place, whether that is misunderstandings that happen, nothing is done until the deal is done, money's changed hands, and the domain has changed hands. Now, these are 5 dimensions to how to acquire a domain name. If you're interested and you have a domain name that you're looking to acquire for your brand, the raw version, depending upon the value, reach out to us and you can set up a free consultation meeting and we can help you to walk through this, give you some insights into the 5 steps to acquiring your domain name.